many seniors, many friends and colleagues. And I always believe that in this world where there is a balance of yin yang, positives and negatives, to always start with the positives. So while most of the talks these days focus on stress, and most of you are well aware of the stress, especially if this COVID times have created, I would like to talk about something more positive in the hope that it will subdue the negatives. So let's begin with my talk on optimism in times of uncertainty. Uh, the topic, that is uncertainty, sprites many feelings, but mostly uncertainty leads to a feeling of pessimism amongst people. So therein lies the need for optimism. Generally, human mind is hardwired to search for security, and security is derived from order and predictability in life. And the COVID era has suddenly changed this order and this predictability of our lives. So it's natural to be a pessimist and natural to be anxious, natural to be maybe depressed. But has it happened for the first time in our history? So here I would like to quote a famous historian, Howard Zinn, who has chronicled many uncertain and many difficult times in our history. As we know, there has been a previous pandemic also. So he says that to understand optimism, we should also look at the contrast, that is pessimism. So first I'll read out what is pessimism. He says it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It reproduces itself by crippling our willingness to act. And then he says what we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. And that is the optimism of uncertainty. To very simply say, the slide says that many people see adversity as a problem, but some people focus on the opportunity which lies ahead. So adversity or opportunity, this paradigm is slowly shifting towards opportunity. As the COVID pandemic is continuing and most of us have realized that the end is nowhere near, people have started to be optimists and are looking for opportunities in these challenging and adverse times, because optimism gives a meaning to life. So while we can focus on reducing our stress, but optimism gives us a way forward, what to look for ahead. Now, why I chose optimism instead of many other things which are prescribed to be mentally healthy or have mental well-being, was that there is a lot of maze of mental health messages. People are prescribed to reduce distress, manage their anger, be a good, having a good lifestyle, so many things. But where to start? So I think a good start would be to change our attitudes. And in terms of attitudes, optimistic attitude is an important ingredient. Just like there is a dish with too many ingredients, but you might not notice what is missing except for a few key ingredients. Let's take, for example, salt. So maybe optimism is that salt for our recipe for a happy life. So first I'll just briefly describe what is the attitude. So attitude is something deeper than simply having a knowledge of something. It is a learned tendency to evaluate things in a certain way. And this leads to a lasting change which generally develops over time. So let's take, for example, people ask, what is your attitude towards politics? Some people say, okay, I dislike it. I don't take any interest in politics. For example, for you surgeons, I can say, some people say his attitude is very reluctant towards surgeries. So we can understand that attitude is something of a background which colors every other thing that we do. So right attitude can help you learn many helpful behaviors. So here I am focusing on the attitude of optimism. Although there are some other positive attitudes, for example, gratitude, mindfulness, but let's focus on optimism. Let's focus on one message at a time so that there is something to take home, something we can implement. So optimism is a mental attitude reflecting a belief or hope that the outcome of a specific endeavor would be favorable, desirable, positive, or more simply that the future will work out for the best. Some people call it positive bias, or that you just don't want to accept the reality. But then, is it so? Let's see. Recent evidence says that the benefits of optimism are very broad. They lead to a higher motivation, lower stress levels, better mental health, better health outcomes, longer lifespan. But wait, most of the mental health talks that we go through claim the same. Good sleep can also lead to all these, physical exercises can also lead to all these, anger management, etc., etc. But here it is important to understand that optimism is upstream to all these. So it's an attitude which will moderate how you take up this physical exercise as a routine or not, how you manage your anger or not. So focusing on optimism might lead to benefits in many other areas. So what are the major traits of an optimist? So major traits of an optimist are personalization. So an optimist generally does not personalize everything when things go right or when things go wrong. He also tends to focus on external circumstances. So while you are not very happy when you gain something, because you understand it's the circumstances which have also played a role, you also do not blame yourself that much. Second is permanence. Optimists tend to view bad times as temporary, which is very important because times actually change. We cannot predict future. And third is pervasiveness. So pervasiveness is like something like air, which pervades every part, every area of the building or earth. So optimists experiences failure in one area, they do not let it influence their beliefs in others. So they are on a firm ground. So these three are the major traits on optimists, and you can maybe think of yourself in these terms or others in these terms, and we can place ourselves on a spectrum from extreme of pessimism to extreme optimism and the gray areas in between. Now, the question arises that easier said than done, how can one be optimist in these in these trying times or when faced with adversity? And especially one does not have this attitude since long. One has been very cautious, one has been very focused on safeguarding himself from negatives. So now how can you tilt yourself towards optimism that you will focus first on positives, then you will think of negatives? So Martin Seligman, a psychologist par excellence who is credited with the learned helplessness model of depression, and it is one of the most important models on which the cognitive behavior therapies for depression are based. So he first described pessimism, and around 10 years later, he realized then focusing on negatives is not just enough. And he moved towards the positive psychology, that is, learning optimism. So, first, learned helplessness. So, this was a basic experimental paradigm where a dog was given a lot of shocks whenever he stepped over the pillar. But after a lot of shocks, it was seen that when they stopped giving shocks to that dog, still he didn't try to jump over because he had learned to be helpless. He did not want to help himself. His motivation had gone down. So this is what happens when you be overcautious, when you take things negatively. And then this is a recipe for future vulnerability or risk of depression, anxiety, and other common mental disorders. So then he said that people can still learn optimism. It is not like it is something inborn or it is something temperamental which you cannot change. So he gave the ABCDE model. And now why I want to discuss this with you is because you or me or every one of us can do it on a daily basis, practice it till it becomes an attitude. That is, it becomes subconscious, it becomes your basic inclination rather than pessimism. So adversity, belief, and consequences. These three terms are easier to understand. Let's take the example of COVID-19. So it's an adverse situation, accept it. Belief is that in any adverse situation, we should be tense, we should be depressed, we should not be happy, and it leads to the consequences like you feel stressed, some people even feel the pressure of a mental illness. But should we really think so? As we discussed in the initial slides, every adversity has an opportunity. So here comes the role of not choosing your natural response. So while your natural response in an adversity is to feel sad or stressed, you should try not to be that. So it's very funny, you will try to be a paradoxical response, something similar to when people prescribe in anger management that you should laugh rather than be angry. We have seen this in a movie, Munna Bhai MBBS, I think people remember. So these paradoxical responses actually help you to change your belief system and attitude. So you should dispute this attitude that every adversity should make you feel sad. And then you can think of other responses. So, for example, if you stop seeing patients in face of COVID-19, but how long can you do that? So you should dispute this belief because it arises out of fear. You should consider the probabilities, the risk involved, and then take an informed decision. So we can see the risk involved is not as much as the fear. A graph is doing rounds very commonly that corona cases are increasing, but the fear of people is decreasing, because over time people dispute their beliefs. And then finally, when you have made a start towards a new belief system, you should energize those beliefs. So energization means basically you should consciously think that I will not be stressed. You should remind this to yourself every day you come across negatives, and slowly you will see that as you practice, this conscious process becomes subconscious or automatic, and then it starts to pervade other areas of your life. So maybe you start with this COVID situation that I'll be positive in this, I'll be optimist, and you'll realize that it pervades to many other areas of your life. And this is the aim of practicing optimism. So in the last, I would just say that, like a good combination of a lock and key, or maybe two brothers, mindfulness is a natural corollary to optimism. So optimists are people who think positively of the future, but they also know how to stay in the present, be spontaneous, and as the three lines I've mentioned, anxiety is living in the future, depression is living in the past, but mindfulness is living in the present. So you can just sip your tea for 15 minutes, try not to think about anything else. This is one of the most important mindfulness exercise that has been prescribed in Buddhism. And at the last, I would just summarize by this slide, which is very old, very classical, that when the glass is 50% filled, 50% empty, but technically it is full. It has 50% air and 50% water. So you see this when you're an optimist, they say. So the right attitudes are the bedrock of right behaviors for a fulfilling life. And the eternal optimist says to the critics, better to err on the side of positivity, on the side of happiness, on the side of well-being. So at the last, I will say, I find you are an optimist. Life is a funny way of looking after you. And this is the paradigm of spirituality. So thank you for your patience. And on this note of optimism,